So I think the topic of today is very interesting, leveraging diversity. I not so long ago I had some students writing a thesis on this topic, and that was very nice to supervise students writing a thesis because then they go out and they do literature search and think a lot of thoughts and interview people, and you always get something new out of that. So yeah. And I think also one of the things that I really like about the topic is Sarah and I, we talk about leveraging a specific form of diversity. So, not just diversity per se, but viewpoint diversity. And it is something that I have stolen from Heterodox Academy. Heterodox Academy is a movement in the US which is very much in favor of viewpoint diversity, and it comes out of some of the discussions that's been on campus in especially in the US. I don't know how it is in the UK. In Denmark it is fine. I think as a lecturer at CBS I can say outrageous things and have students contemplate it and reflect it, and I still have my job, so that's good. But on some campuses that's not the case, and of course some teachers are concerned about it because they say, well, in order to have productive learning and dialogue, you need to be able to say outrageous things and bring those things into the conversation, not even because you believe them, just because it is a fruitful contribution to the conversation. For example, you might get very clear on how to refute a viewpoint, but only if you can actually voice the viewpoint. And of course, yes, I think this is why we talk about viewpoint diversity as opposed to diversity per se. Of course, you can also say there's different reasons why diversity is important. One reason has more to do with social responsibility and giving people who might not normally get a chance a chance. This is not our main concern here. Not that it isn't important, but our main concern is leveraging diversity in order to get better organizational outcomes. And therefore, the diversity that we are looking for is viewpoint diversity. And of course, that might coincide with racial diversity, educational diversity, and all these kind of things, but it may not. So sometimes you can have one form of diversity, the more social diversity, and not have viewpoint diversity. So you have a fantastic balance of gender and race and all these kind of things, but everybody went to the same education, and so you don't really have viewpoint diversity. So just to clarify that from the outset.
Yeah. So, yes, I'll say a few words about dialogue, and this might be very familiar to you in a bit of a recap. And I'm also just going to say a little bit from my own experience about this territory of leveraging viewpoint diversity, and then how that enriches dialogue and generates, Emma, as you were talking about, those kind of fresh insights as well. So one moment I can recall is when I was in Washington, D.C., working with an international development bank. And there must have been about 25 of us in the room. And it dawned on me that I was the only, not only was I the only British person, I was the only European in the room. Very diverse group of people from America, Asia, Africa. And my role there was to facilitate the meeting, do some skill building in dialogue. And somehow we got into a conversation about leveraging diversity. And I always remember one person saying to me, if you look around this And some of the most interesting work I've done recently, so I'm thinking about an organisation based in London, consulting organisation, who recently wanted to articulate their organisational purpose, and they wanted to do it in a very co-creative way. And that involved inviting all employees, about 100 employees, of different educational levels, very different backgrounds, very different roles, into a conversation about what was meaningful for them as an organisation. And it was a sort of 3-month process. And at the end of that, we did manage to land an organisational purpose statement that I thought was brilliant. I thought I was very happy with that output. But the brilliance of that output very much came from the fact that there was a diverse range of viewpoints in the room. Some people wanted to really angle the purpose statement towards the customers, others more towards what would be motivating for the employees. The senior leadership team had their eyes on the owners of the business. And so I think, and you'll all know this, that a true dialogue really is a co-creation. And to the extent you've got diverse viewpoints in the room and you can navigate that diversity, it's going to be all the richer co-creation for that. So I might just share a couple of slides at this point with a couple of, and Emma, you referred to David Bohm and the Bohmian perspective on dialogue. So let me just share some slides here. If I can get my slide share working. Just bear with me a moment, please. Okay. Share screen. Ah, Klaus, I think you might need to make me. Yes, thank you very much. I'm now a co-host. Thank you. So, is my screen sharing? Ah, here we go. So I think, here we go. So you can see here, just I'm taking inspiration from the seminal text by William Isaacs on dialogue. But at the heart of his definition of dialogue, it's all about dialogue being a shared inquiry. We surface a question, we explore that question together. Dialogue as a way of thinking and reflecting together. And again, I'm sure this might be familiar to you, this definition of dialogue, where it's a conversation with a centre. So there's actually a topic or a question that we put in the middle of the room that we explore together, rather than people taking sides, fixed positions, entrenched points of view. And if we can come with that orientation, then we can take the energy of difference and diversity and channel it towards something new. And that can lift us out of polarisation and very fixed ways of thinking, defensive positions, and into greater common sense, a shared understanding. And therefore, dialogue can be a way of accessing collective intelligence. And not only that, if you've got that pool of shared understanding, you get more aligned action coming out of it. And just finally, dialogue is this flow of meaning. So there's a dynamism to dialogue. There's an emergent quality to it. But you have to sort of navigate things along the way, and that can include differences in perspective, sometimes moments of conflict as well. And so just one other definition to draw on, and this comes from the work of David Bohm, who was a great friend of Bill Isaacs and informed Bill Isaacs' work. And this is about the energy of dialogue, where there's, as you can see, it says here, there's a different sort of spirit to it. It's not a combative way of interacting. Nobody's trying to win. You're not trying to gain points or make your particular viewpoint prevail. And if a mistake is made, in a way that's seen as a good thing. Maybe I've failed to fully understand what Claus said or the point Jill was making. And actually, you know, in those misunderstandings, or if I didn't listen fully, actually you can all gain potentially from the misunderstanding. So there's this real generosity of spirit to dialogue. And so maybe at this point, Claus, I hand across to you and you just say a few words about why this viewpoint diversity is so essential for organisational success. I'll stop the share here and hand across to you, Claus.
So since you're here, I'm sure you will agree that viewpoint diversity is important, but even so, it's kind of nice to clarify or say why is it actually important in some more detail. And of course, one of the reasons viewpoint diversity is important is that groups are remarkably intelligent, and sometimes groups can be smarter than the smartest person in the group. And by having good ways of leveraging viewpoint diversity, you can tap into that collective intelligence. So this is why being skilled at facilitating dialogue can be such a good way of leveraging that collective intelligence. Another reason is, well, we all heard about or know about this lemming effect, right? Where one person has an idea, everybody else agrees, and then we've all heard about this groupthink and the dangers of groupthink, where something can seem obviously true and you just go with it and you don't ask questions because everybody's on the same page. It feels great because everybody works together and you agree. But if your fundamental assumptions are wrong, then that's a problem. When I teach at CBS, I often like to, there's an example that I found in an article, I think by Starbuck, and I don't remember the other guy's name, but they talk about an organization that made mechanical calculators, high quality mechanical calculators. They'd done it for a number of years, for decades, and it had been the foundation of their success. And so and then they expanded into office furniture and all sorts of things. And at some point, I assume none of you own a mechanical calculator, because in the 50s, when the chips got invented, nobody really continued with mechanical calculators. But they didn't see it. They saw declining sales, and then they were like, how do you respond to declining sales? You cut off the extra stuff and focus on your core competency, right? So we just double down on mechanical calculators. That was a bad gamble. And actually, there were engineers who came and presented electronic calculators to the management and said, I think this is going to be big. And they said, nah, yeah, it's a fad. It'll pass. So there's something about having the full group talking that's really, really important. And of course, here was a disagreement, right? Some people said we should start doing electronic calculators. Others said, no, we have a good core business. That could have been a very productive disagreement. There might have been, if those two people, the engineers, the management, had taken each other seriously, they might have come up with a very good plan for transitioning. So yes, that's really important. Other reasons viewpoint, I think also one of the reasons viewpoint diversity is so important is that many decisions affect different people, and depending on your educational background, your position in the organization, your relationship to the product or service, you can spot different parts of consequences of decisions. And before you make a decision, you really want a good overview of the potential consequences. Because maybe it will have amazing consequences in one area, but then if you just focus on that and you don't have anybody who can see negative consequences in another area, you might overlook or have a blind spot that makes you overlook something that would be detrimental to the organization. So I think these are some of the reasons that viewpoint diversity is key to have and to be able to leverage. So do you want to say something about the criteria, Sarah?
I will, thank you, Klaus. So we're going to shortly get on to 3 tools for the application of all of this. But just to share one more piece around our thinking that gets us onto then the tools. And this is inspired in part by the book, I don't know if any of you have read it, The Wisdom of Crowds. I don't know if this rings a bell at all. It was published a few years ago, but one of the conclusions in that book by James Sirowiski or something like that is he concludes it's as if we've been programmed to be collectively smart. But the catch is that there are certain conditions that need to be met in order for collective smartness to be the case. And he took some of his inspiration for his book from a classic experiment that psychologists have done involving a jar of jelly beans. You might be familiar with this experiment, but briefly the way it works is you get a big jar of jelly beans and you ask people to estimate how many jelly beans are in the jar. And people make their calculation. And what they have found is that typically the most accurate estimate is the arithmetic mean of all the individuals' estimates. It's the arithmetic mean that's more accurate normally than any one individual. And that has led to his conclusion it's as if the collective is wired to be more intelligent than the individuals. But certain conditions need to be in place in order for that to be true. There are 4 things he found, and they're summarised in The Wisdom of Crowds. And the first of them is exactly what we're exploring here, which is diversity of viewpoint. So you want to get in the room people who've got some information that is particular to them. And he says, even if it is quite an eccentric interpretation of the known facts, that can be valuable. You really want diversity. The second condition for that collective intelligence is what he would call independence. So people's opinions are not determined by the opinions of those around them. So going back to the jelly bean experiment, you only get that pattern of results if you get people to individually make their estimation first. If you get people to have a chat and then have a group discussion and then they're kind of blurring all their thinking quite early on, you don't get that result of the whole being more intelligent than any one individual. And so what does that mean for us as dialogue practitioners or as managers holding meetings? It's always really good to create opportunities for some individual thinking, some self-listening, if you like, before you invite people to listen to others, to listen to the whole room. So you might give people questions to reflect on and time to journal, sentences to complete, and so on, so that the individual is grounded in their own thinking and their own viewpoint. Number 3 condition is what he would call decentralization. So by that he means people are able to specialize and draw on their own local knowledge. So again, you want people to be really keying into what the viewpoint is of their particular department or their particular role. If I just go back quickly to the purpose articulation work that I spoke a bit about earlier, I invited people to bring to the workshop an object that reflected, that encapsulated the purpose of the organisation from their particular viewpoint, whether they were on the phone to customers, whether they were a senior director, whether they were one of the trainers, and so on. So you want that local perspective to be in the mix. And then finally, pay attention to this 4th condition of aggregation, as it gets called. So you want to be thinking through what your mechanism is for moving from the more individual viewpoint into a more collective decision or shared understanding. And you don't want to move too quickly into that. So again, if I go back to the purpose articulation work we did, then we had a series of 3 workshops, and there was a draft purpose. There were 3 draft purpose statements that came out of each of those 3 workshops, and then we thought very carefully about the dialogue session we had with a working group that had people from all 3 workshops about how we were going to crystallise a final purpose statement from, in effect, 9 draft purpose statements. So I won't go into the detail of that, just pay attention to aggregation. So those are the 4 conditions: diversity of viewpoint, independence, decentralisation or local knowledge, and aggregation. So all of that said, how about some tools then to keep it really practical? So Claus, do you want to talk through a couple of these?
Yes. So the first tool that we are gonna talk about here for how to leverage viewpoint diversity is about who to get in the room. That is a really good first question when you want to leverage viewpoint diversity. Who should be in the room? You can't have everybody in the room, but and that's fine. But you do want the right people in the room. So one of the first things that you can do is to simply make a list of internal stakeholders and external stakeholders, like all the groups of people who might have some sort of interest in whatever it is you are going to be talking about, and then consider who can represent the viewpoint from that group, who would have localized knowledge and be able to articulate that localized knowledge. And it's good to systematically think through this, because if you just sit there and go, oh, I think we should have this person and that person and this person, you might forget somebody. But simply write out a list. Here's all the internal stakeholders, all the external stakeholders, and then ask the same question for every single group on your list. Would these people be affected by what we're talking about? And if they are, it might be a good idea to have them in the room. Also, it's good to ask yourself, do the people on this list, or who has specialized skills relating to implementation? Many times you can have very good dialogues, but then and maybe you say, well, the people implementing them, they're not particularly affected, they just have to implement it, right? But they are affected because they're the ones who have to carry the burden of the implementation. And sometimes your ideas create specific problems for the people who should implement the ideas. I remember once I was working with a large transportation company in Denmark. And I was, long story, but I was working as a manager in the customs department because we get all the packages, and then it has to be cleared with customs and before it can be delivered. And that's a very time-sensitive process. You can't start the customs declaration process before the packages are physically in the country. And that's like 5 or 6 in the morning, right? They arrive at the airport or at the border on the trucks or something like that. And then fundamentally before the packages arrive at the sorting station, which is not long, all packages have to be cleared with customs so that they can scan the packages, and the ones that customs want to look at can be taken aside. If it doesn't work, then they take aside a lot of packages. And if you're the manager of the department, they're going to call you very early in the morning and shout at you. And you don't want that, right? So, so yeah. And I remember when I was, I didn't have the specialized knowledge that the people who were sitting with and making the custom clearances every day had. So every single time I had to meet with the other department managers, I took somebody who from the lowest level in the organization and brought with me to the management meeting. And they were 90% of the time the coolest person in the room, because everybody would sit there and make decisions and go like, we should do it like that. And then my employee there would put up his or her hand and say, well, actually, we can't do that, because that's not how the system works. And then everybody would be a bit baffled and say, well, how should we do it? And then they will say how they should do it. And then they would say, okay, I suppose we do it like that. Crucial to have that person in the room. So really important to have people with valuable specialist skills in the room. Another group of people that is very good to have in the room are the naysayers. It's always nice to have somebody who's comfortable playing the devil's advocate, who's comfortable just saying, I think that's a bad idea. Even if everybody agrees this is a good idea, they're very comfortable sort of like sitting there cross-armed and saying, nah, I don't think that's going to work. Because you need somebody who can voice the opposition. You need somebody who can point out the potential flaws. That's crucial to have them in the room. It's also very good to have very junior people in the room. Sometimes junior people have a very fresh perspective. Maybe they come from a different organizational background, a different culture, and they will say, well, the last place I worked, we did it like this, or we definitely didn't do it like this. Or so they're not blinded by assimilation into the organizational culture yet. So very good to have them in the room. And then, of course, at the other end of the spectrum, very good to have the old guard, to have the most senior people in the room, because they very often represent the organizational memory. They remember that we tried that 10 years ago and this was the result. And sometimes you can say, yeah, but times have changed. But sometimes times haven't changed that much. So it's very good to have those senior people in the room as well. So this is just some ideas about, like, write up the list, everybody you can think of, and then have these questions in mind. Look at your lists of potential stakeholders that might be good to have in the conversation. Ask yourself, who's affected? Do we have everybody, a representative of everybody who's affected? Do we have the people with intimate specialist knowledge that would be useful? Do we have somebody who's very comfortable with saying no and pointing out flaws? And do we have both senior and junior people in the room? If you have that, you will have a pretty good blend, and that's a wonderful start for a dialogue. Then the next thing that we will talk about is a little bit what Sarah was talking about before. One of the conditions is independence. You want to avoid groupthink. You want people to be able to voice their opinion independently, and that's important in order to tap into the wisdom of the crowd. And one of the problems that we often come across is that certain voices exert a very big influence on others. So it's very good to pay attention to power dynamics and to think about power dynamics and how to ensure that you maintain independence of thinking despite those power dynamics. Some people may see problems, but they don't say anything about it because maybe they're still within their first few months of being hired, and they're really concerned with passing their test period, right? So that they can't be kicked out too easily. Or maybe they're up for a promotion and they don't want to sit in a meeting and say, well, actually the person that's going to promote me, I think, is saying some rubbish, right? So there can be all sorts of reasons why certain voices are not being heard. One of the ways that you can attend to power dynamics is by thinking very carefully of speaking order. Who speaks first? If the most senior person speaks first, maybe everybody else is just going to fall in line. Or maybe certain people with a lot of unofficial power in the organization who can make your life difficult. If they speak first, other people might say, "Ooh, I'm just gonna fall in line here." So very interesting to think about speaking order, and there's all sorts of things you can do with this. You can choose and point out people and say, what do you think, and then you can counsel more senior people or people in more positions of power to say, maybe you listen more than speak here. That's a good counsel. Sometimes they will be open to that. You can have people discuss things in groups so that at least not all groups will be influenced by the voices of the more powerful people in the room, and so on. But the upshot is pay attention to speaking order as a way of attending to power dynamics. Another way of attending to power dynamics is to support the people who are standing in a more vulnerable position. And this can be done, again, this is just up to your creativity how to do this. If you are a facilitator of dialogue, you are in a position of power. And if you lend credibility to the people that you know might be in more vulnerable positions, so when they speak, you may jump in and say, that's a really good point. And you sort of boost that point a little bit. And then other people will, because if you don't do it, they might just go like, it's just, I don't know, James or Jenny or whoever, right? Who cares? But if you as a facilitator comes in and boost it and say, that's actually a very good point, other people might listen more. So sometimes you can lend your authority to the vulnerable people. You can also think about having an element of anonymity in the group. Sarah sometimes talk about putting issues in a hat, and then you pull out the papers from the hats, and then you discuss whatever you pull out of the hat. Also a way that at least it's possible for people to be comfortable putting in their voice even if they are in a more vulnerable position. And then of course also thinking through, like Sarah was saying before, thinking through how you aggregate things. Many times if you have a dialogue, a lot of ideas and insights are going to emerge, and you don't want insights to be lost during the aggregation process. Sometimes power dynamics can take charge of the aggregation process, so actually you get all the good insights, but then when you want to consolidate this, certain people might take over and it gets into the habitual mold. One of the questions that I really like that Sarah is often using is one of the models that we are working with when we work with dialogue is this model of having 4 different conversational fields. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but one of the transitions is to transition from the conversational field where all the insights are emerging, right? This fountain of insights, and then going from that field, which is field number 3, to field number 4, where it all gets consolidated and we sort of draw the conclusions. And one question that you can use there is to say, if this group spoke with one voice, what would it say? Very good question to use for the aggregation process, because then if during the aggregation process power dynamics take over, you might point out and say, well, certainly a part of the group would say that, but it seems that this particular message is leaving out some of the insights that have emerged. And in that way you can ensure or pay attention to power dynamics through the aggregation process. Good. So those were two concrete tools. Make a list of people, choose very deliberately who's in the room, and then pay attention to power dynamics so that you create that space for insights to emerge and survive through the aggregation process. Good. So Sarah, do you want to say a little bit about the last tool?
Thank you, Claus. So one final tool, and then we want to open this up and we really welcome your questions and comments. Final third tool about leveraging viewpoint diversity. And this is all in with the intention of doubling down on individuals bringing their own local knowledge and kind of the independence of thought. And this is about, in a way, what happens before you get in the room together and then once you're in the room together as well. So it can be really helpful if resources allow for you to have a series of one-to-one conversations with people before coming to the dialogue. And if you're able to do that, there's a couple of questions that I find really fruitful to include. So one is just simply, what would be a great outcome of this meeting, of this dialogue, of this discussion? And I often anonymise people's responses to that and put a version of that anonymised version at the start of the meeting. And sometimes you've got viewpoint diversity right there in those great outcomes. One team I worked with, there was one comment that said it would be great for us to build on the trust in the team, and there was another comment that said there's a lack of trust in this team that we need to talk about. So just having those 2 outcomes plus another outcomes from other people got us into a rich conversation early on in that session, and that was harvesting comments made in those one-to-ones. You might also share in advance, before the meeting, some of the questions you're going to explore at the meeting, so people can be mulling over the topic and the territory before they even get into the room. So if, for example, it's going to be a dialogue around purpose, you might put questions out like, when's a time you felt proud to work for this organisation, what contributed to that, and so on. And that's an easy way in to getting people to think about what makes their work energising and meaningful. I've already spoken about asking people to bring an object to the meeting related to the theme of the dialogue. Variations on that I've sometimes used have been bring a piece of music. Music is, as we all know, highly subjective. And that even strong reactions to other people's pieces of music can get you into a rich dialogue. And it's a great right hemisphere, if I can put it like that, less rational, more poetic, more creative way into a dialogue, the use of music or poetry, for example. And then the final thing I'll just speak about briefly is a pattern, and you might have heard Claus and I speak about it before, but at the session, even when you've got 8 people in the room or 12 or even 80 people in the room, is before you go into groups, but get people to pair up and do some work. And Emma, I think you write about this in your work, where you split out the role very clearly of speaker and listener. And you invite people, in effect, perhaps to do a monologue, have some uninterrupted thinking time when they're the speaker. The listener's job is to stay present, to hold space, so that people can actually follow the thread of their own thinking in a held way. And that could be followed by 5 minutes each way, another 5 minutes to reflect together on what you've learned, what you've heard. Nancy Klein, in her Time to Think work, has a wonderful question: what's your freshest thinking now? So having done a pattern like that early on in a meeting or a dialogue session, you might invite all the pairs to come back and ask them, what's your freshest thinking now that you've had the opportunity to really root into your own thinking and to bring that into the dialogue. So that's tool, you could call it laying the groundwork in some way, or getting the individual thinking really working. So that covers our 3 tools. You've heard lots from Claus and I, so maybe just in this final 10 minutes, let's open it up. Questions, comments, really welcome about this whole, how we leverage viewpoint diversity so it doesn't derail a conversation, but it enriches it. So